And when I was looking at the history of Victoria and the stories from those times, I realized that my favorite stories from the past are the ghost stories, the past that never left.
I sing, and all you feel is air. I scream, you act like no one's there. I know you feel me, I know you see. You're never lonely in a haunted home.
My favorite local ghost story is the ghost of John Todd House. Now, John Todd came over to Canada in the very early 1800s as a mad Scottish teenager with nothing but a Bible, a medical encyclopedia, and a book of Robbie Burns poems. They hand him out of customs as they're leaving. And he worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. And he was a very intense young man and spent a lot of time talking like this about things that he would not be corrected on. And he once pissed off the chief factor of the HBC so much he got sent to Fort Macleod for 9 years. When he came back, he could barely speak English. I mean, no one else did up there, why keep it up? Another time he ended a standoff at Fort Kamloops by waving a powder keg over his head and threatening to blow up the entire fort and everyone in it, including himself. He won and survived. But if you can picture a man like this, very intense, hard to argue with, moves around a lot, can you see him getting married a little more than once? Like 7 times? 3 white women, 4 First Nations from different areas. They don't get named so much in history books. But he did eventually live long enough to retire, unlike most people. And he bought a whole bunch of land in Oak Bay, and he built a big house. He lived in the house, he died in the house. It went to his children, who sold it to someone who did not keep it for very long, for reasons that will soon become apparent. And she sold it in the very early 1940s to retired Colonel T.C. Evans and his wife. Now, by the time the Evans were looking for the house, the neighborhood gossip by then was pretty clear that the house was haunted. But Evans was a sensible military man who did not believe in ghosts, so they bought the house. The haunting became apparent very quickly. Everything in the house liked to move by itself. Doors would swing open, things on hooks swung back and forth, the hats on the hat rack strewed themselves across the hallway while the rocking chair rocked on its own. Their first Christmas in the house. They spent all the Christmas Eve decorating and putting up the tree, and they woke up on Christmas morning to find all the decorations off the tree, off the wall, and piled neatly in the middle of the living room floor. The ghost, Colonel Evans observed, also hated Christmas.
My soul is so weary I could sing. My bones lie cold beneath the ground. I feel so weary, so very weary. You're never lonely in a haunted house.
The first bedroom they chose for themselves, they soon found that neither of them could actually sleep in. So they moved downstairs and started calling the old room the Eerie Room. But they continued to, paint and redecorate, and even the Eerie Room got a fresh coat. A few nights after they had moved downstairs, there was a huge crash in the backyard, and there was a window from the Eerie Room in the grass. And there was no rotted wood, no loose nails. It was as if some force from inside had pushed the window out. Now, during the Second World War, Colonel Evans, remembering what it was liked to have young servicemen on weekend leave come and stay with them. And one weekend they had these 2 guys from the Air Force Base, but the house was kind of crowded. There was just this one empty room upstairs that no one did much with. So they put them up there, and the 2 men woke in the middle of the night to the sound of rattling chains. And one, when he opened his eyes, saw the image of a First Nations woman in chains, her arms outstretched as if pleading for help, her mouth moving, but no sound coming out.
when all you feel is air. I scream, you act like no one's there. I know you see me, I know you feel me. You're never lonely in a haunted.
So when they came back in the late morning, they told their story. And that was when it first started to get into the newspapers. Which is when people started to write to the Colonel with helpful advice like, leave out a bucket of water, that always gets rid of ghosts. Or, leave the ghost a pen and paper and it can tell you its story. Someone actually addressed a letter to Colonel Evans, the haunted house, Victoria, and it got there. But they kept living in the house and renovating and modernizing. As Mrs. Evans said, you're never lonely in a haunted house.
That's true.
And one year, Christmas decorations had stayed up, things were going good, they decided to have a New Year's party. And everything was going fine, and the New Year's party had all their friends over until a biscuit tin on a hook on the kitchen fireplace decided to swing back and forth by itself for 35 minutes straight, to the alarmed attention of most of the party. And that was when word really got out. There was a story in the Vancouver Sun, CBC Radio did a special from the haunted house, and that's how the Evans discovered that the only thing more annoying than a haunted house is a famous haunted house. Not only were the letters pouring in, but people were driving slowly down Heron Street and peering in windows. But they kept living in the house. It was theirs now. And they were continuing to modernize and renovate. And one day, the Colonel had these two guys over to dig a hole for a fuel tank for an oil-burning furnace that could have central heating. Until they dug up the skeleton. Which is to say, they dug up part of the skeleton, realized it was human, and that was the end of that. Those two guys knew about that house, it was famous after all, and it would have been tough to come in the first place and no amount of money was going to get them to continue. So the Colonel dug the hole himself, and he put in the fuel tank, and he took the bones to a specialist, who concluded they were the bones of a woman, either Asian or First Nations, and it was very hard to tell because the bones were heavily degraded from being buried in quicklime. Now, some people heard the story and they said, John Todd was smuggling Asians. There was a secret passageway from the kitchen to the beach, and he smuggled Asians. Now, there was a secret passageway, but it seemed to have more to do with John Todd's late-life paranoia than any post-retirement business activities. Other people heard the story and thought the bones might more likely belong to one of his First Nations wives who had gone mad and been confined to an upstairs bedroom. Now, whoever it was, as soon as those bones were given a decent burial somewhere far from the house, the haunting stopped. Now, John Todd House is still standing in Oak Bay. You can still drive slowly down Heron Street and annoy the inhabitants by staring in the windows. But it's mostly not haunted anymore.
You're never lonely in a haunted house. Although my bones are long and pressed, I found that I will not go down under the ground. I know that death has come and gone, but my lonely soul lives on. You're never lonely in a haunted house. Though you're